Hello everyone. Sure. Hello everyone. I, Pratham, on behalf of the Dark, welcome you all to what is the fifth installment of a book discussion series. Today, we will be discussing Dr. Oishik Sircar's Ways of Remembering Law, Cinema, and Collective Memory in the New India. A bit about the Dark first. The Dark began in 2023 as a book review journal, publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the very get go, we have sought to reimagine the form of the book review itself, encouraging writing that moves beyond summary to engage deeply, reflectively, creatively, and critically with the world that a book opens up for us. Over time, we have grown into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviews, explainers, commentaries, and research essays. Each issue is built around a central theme, bringing together diverse voices that explore the intersections across social sciences. A double-blind peer review process ensures rigor, while an editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. Beyond the journal, the Dark has also grown into a vibrant collective. Through our reading groups, we meet every month to discuss a shared book, discovering new perspectives through conversation. Through the Dark Weekly, we publish personal essays, topical reflections, and explainers that extend our conversations into the present moment. The Dark Baithak is a humble attempt to huddle together a group of scholars, writers, students from different fields to present ideas and initiate dialogue, bringing critical conversations into life. A bit about our speaker today, Dr. Oishik Sarkar. Uh, Dr. Oishik Sarkar at Melbourne Law School. He is the author of Ways of Remembering, Law, Cinema, and Collective Memory in the New India, and Violent Modernities, Cultural Lives of Law in the New India. We welcome Dr. Sarkar and are super excited for the discussion. As the chair of today's discussion, we have Dr. Sanjukta Nath. Dr. Sanjukta Nath is a senior editor at The Tag. She envisions and directs interdisciplinary conversations for the vertical. She is also assistant professor in the School of Liberal Arts, Guru Gobind Singh University. She specializes in gender, international politics, international law, sexual and gender-based violence. And now I would like to hand over to Dr. Sanjukta Nath to moderate the discussion further. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pratham. Thank you, Dr. Oishik, for agreeing for the thing. Kindly please start the meeting, start the discussion, then we can carry it from that.
So I just want to confirm. So, Pratham, you want me to introduce the book? And is that how we're beginning?
So the usual format is that you can speak for around 30 minutes about the book, the main arguments, what inspired you, but anything about the book, you can speak, and then we will take it from there. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts about ways of remembering. Um, I'm glad it's still, possible to discuss a book that's come out 2 years back. Uh, I'm very grateful to the team at the Dark um, for this opportunity because, I've been following some of the work that you've been doing, and so I reached out, and I'm glad that we've been able to do this. And thank you to those who've joined. And so, um, Ways of Remembering is a book that comes out of um, my PhD thesis. I wrote it in 2012. So it took a while for it to come out since completing it. But its origins actually lie, much, the if I have to talk about an origin story, it goes back to 2002 when I visited Gujarat as part of a fact-finding team of human rights lawyers that was put together by the South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center in Delhi. And it's that visit, and I was a, young law student then, just about to graduate from law school, with great faith in the law, as it were. And I, it's not an exaggeration to say that visit to Gujarat really changed my life and the way I started looking at the law. Um, so why did I write? So, I went on to become a human rights lawyer after that, and then took a turn towards doing full-time academic work and returned to writing a PhD on my experiences of working in Gujarat as a human rights lawyer, almost 10 years after I visited Gujarat in 2002. Now, there are three reasons why, there could have been many other topics that I could have worked on for my PhD. Why did I choose to write on Gujarat 2002? And the three reasons were this. One is a reason that's on the aside, but later seems to have played a very important role in the way in which the book comes together. So, for those of you who haven't read but have only read the blurb about the book, this is a book that studies the way in which collective memory of the 2002 anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat is reconstructed through two archives. One is the archive of legal judgments, and the other is the archive of Bombay cinema. Now, it's it's an unusual, coming together of archives. Um, Although there is a long tradition in the discipline of law where scholars have studied law and cinema, or to look at the way in which law is represented as cinema. Um, I was more interested in the way in which the distinction between fact and fiction, which is cinema being a fictitious mode of storytelling, and law being a mode of storytelling that relies heavily on facts, in fact, are blurred in the way in which the memories of 2002 um, are remade through these two archives. But I'll come to that bit a little later. So let me tell you what the first reason for returning to Gujarat 2002 as to write a PhD was on. So in Gujarat, when I visited as part of the fact-finding team, the first city we stayed in was in Ahmedabad, and we went to live with the relative of one of the members of the team. And this person, his relatives lived on an upmarket area on the Hindu side of the Sabarmati, and that road was called the Judge's Bungalow Road. And we used to take an auto rickshaw every morning from Judge's Bungalow Road, cross the bridges over the Sabarmati, and go to what proverbially was called the Muslim side of the city, and go to the Shah Alam Dargah, which was a mosque turned into a makeshift refugee camp in the wake of the violence. So thousands of displaced families, were living there. So, of course, there was the starkness of moving across the same city and parts of it which looked completely different from each other. Uh, but that's not the story. The story is that every day when I took this auto rickshaw from Judges Bungalow Road to Shah Alam Camp and back, I had this very fat book called Criminal Major Acts in my hand, which is a compendium of criminal laws in India. And the reason I carried it was because whenever we were collecting survivor testimonies, we were trying to see which crime would apply to the incident of violence that was being described by the survivors. So I had this very fat book of criminal major acts in my hand, and in the auto rickshaw, anybody who's lived in Ahmedabad would know it has, auto rickshaws that are painted on the inside with pictures of Bollywood stars, right? So my everyday travel was, on the one hand, was the heavy copy of Criminal Major Acts, and those who accompanied me, across the Sabarmati were these Bollywood stars. I didn't actually pay a lot of attention to the fact that they were there with me in this journey. But 10 years later, when I returned to working on Gujarat 2002 through the lens of law and cinema, it seemed like there was a message there that law and cinema had to come together for a later work that I had to do. So, so it was quite serendipitous that my return to uh, Gujarat 2002 had to happen through law and cinema, which was very much a part of my everyday journey when I was in Ahmedabad. Now, the second reason, um, why bring law and cinema together to think about Gujarat 2002 is quite loyally, particularly in the context of the relationship between law and cinema in the Indian context. There is a landmark Supreme Court judgment called the K.S. Abbas judgment. And the K.S. Abbas judgment is unique for a particular reason. It's a judgment on cinema censorship. But what the Abbas judgment tells us, amongst other things, is that cinema is a very unique medium, such a unique medium that it's very different from a medium like a novel or poetry. And so the judgment exceptionalizes cinema as the only medium, uh, even when it's fictitious, that requires state regulation. So no other medium, you write a book about something, you don't need something like the Central Board of Film Certification to first give it the necessary legal imprimatur to be able to be released to the public. Cinema is the only medium where such a regulatory mechanism is at work. So um, I wanted to see what was the relationship between cinema uh, and law when it came to Gujarat 2002. The third reason is more disciplinary. So, um, um, so there are three ways in which law and cinema scholarship has been carried out. One is what can be referred to as the mimetic mode of doing law and cinema scholarship. So the mimetic mode is where those who are doing law and cinema scholarship are interested in looking at whether cinema represents law correctly, right? So whether cinema mimes law, right? So if you look at a film like Damini, or you look at a film like Awara, you can look at a film like Pink, or all of these films where a court scene is so central to the narrative, or you're looking at uh, OTT shows like Mamla Legal Hai, or you're looking at what was that other film, uh, or you're looking at a film like Court, for example. Uh, uh, as a legal scholar, you're interested in seeing how well is the law represented in these films, right? So a legal scholar will be interested in trying to correct cinema's incorrect representation of the law. Right? So one would, for example, say court has the most realistic representation of how the judiciary works. One would, for example, say that even if Pink is such a powerful film, arguments in courts are never that dramatic, for instance. Right? Now, I'm not very interested, at least the book is not interested in thinking about the relationship between law and cinema in this mimetic fashion. Um, I'm not critiquing cinema for its inability to represent law in in the realist way, or appreciating cinema for its ability to do so. Right. So that's a area of law and cinema scholarship, but this book does not do that. The second way of doing law and cinema scholarship that's quite popular in in the Indian context is the regulatory mode of thinking about the relationship between law and cinema. And this is particularly scholarship that's interested in questions of censorship, right? So what role does cinema law play in regulating the stories that cinema tells, right? So, when does the censor board intervene? Um, this regulatory mode of studying the relationship between law and cinema is also, for example, interested in extra legal modes of regulation, right? So it's not only where the CBFC steps in, but this is also where, say, you have a private citizen moving court to say that this film, should be censored because it's hurting the sentiments of a particular community. Or you would, for example, have vigilante groups that target cinema by, protesting against a theater or vandalizing, cinema posters. So one of those earlier instances of such vigilante action against cinema was the kind of um, right-wing protests you had against the film Fire, Deepa Mehta's Fire. And so a lot of the regulatory mode in which that relationship was playing out was extra legal in nature. There's a third way in which law and cinema scholarship is carried out, which can be referred to as the reparative mode, right? So where you try and um, read cinema as a worthy source of legal wisdom, right? So, what does cinema have to say about justice? So, this is not where you're thinking about whether cinema represents law correctly or incorrectly. You're not interested in thinking about whether law has the capacity to regulate cinema or what other, extra legal modes of regulation is carried out in the context of cinema. This is where, independent of what the law actually says or not, you're interested in looking at cinema and trying to see, whether the story has lessons for us about how to think about questions of justice, for instance, right? So, you look at a film like Awara, for instance, and pay attention to the closing scene of Awara and Raj Kapoor's final, soliloquy in the courtroom space about the class hierarchy of Indian society. Or you'll see a film like Shahenshah, Amitabh Bachchan Shahenshah, where the last scene is quite dramatic, where the court fails to provide justice. So the vigilante figure in Shahenshah enters the courtroom to deliver justice. Um, so, so the reparative mode of doing law and cinema scholarship is primarily interested in thinking of cinema as an independent source of legal wisdom, right? Now, my way of doing law and cinema scholarship draws on all three of these, but I don't necessarily do law and cinema scholarship in any of these three ways. What I'm primarily interested in, as I mentioned earlier, is to blur the fact fiction distinction, right? So, in all these three modes, law and cinema have distinct meanings. In my mode of doing the kind of analysis that I am doing, I am more interested in trying to see where do these distinctions actually blur, right? So, which is why I am interested in looking or reading for what I'm calling the aesthetic in the uh, in in the texts of judgments, And I'm interested in looking for the jurisprudential in the texts of the films. Um, and in the way I see the films and the judgments reconstruct the collective memory of Gujarat 2002, we actually see that this distinction between fact and fiction give away, right? So, um, and give away in a way where it's not cinema that starts mimicking law, it's actually law that starts, in a certain sense, mimicking cinema. So, although the book is about Gujarat 2002, the focus is quite narrow. I work with a particular time period. And what I'm looking at is the immediate post-pogrom decade. And so it's a concentrated period. It's also an important period because the pogrom takes place in 2002, and about a decade later, in 2014, the BJP government comes to power at the center. Um, and so what happened in that post-pogrom decade is quite important for us to have a sense of what happens to India afterwards. So in this post-pogrom decade, I look at the four judgments coming out of one of the most controversial criminal trials related to the pogrom, which is the Best Bakery trial. And the judgments are travel through the whole hierarchy of the Indian judiciary. So starting with the Sessions Court in Baroda to the Gujarat High Court in Ahmedabad to the Supreme Court, twice in the Supreme Court, and then again it travels to another, trial court in Bombay. Now, the Best Bakery trial is a really important trial because it was the first major trial emerging out of the pogrom, with specific regard to a massacre that took place in the city of Baroda, in this, building called the Best Bakery. Um, and it was also one of the most controversial of trials because, in the first instance, all the 21 accused in the trial were acquitted. That acquittal was upheld by the Gujarat High Court. And then the case went to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court uh, acknowledged that what resulted in the acquittal was the deeply compromised mode in which the trial was carried out, where there was immense political intervention. And this immense political intervention also led to the trial's key witness, Zahira Sheikh, recanting her statement or turning hostile, as one calls it, in court. That resulted in the acquittal. So the Supreme Court acknowledged the vitiating factors that resulted in the miscarriage of justice, as it were. And in the history of criminal law in India, for the first time ever, uh, the Supreme Court ordered a retrial to take place outside of the state that has jurisdiction um, on the case. So the Supreme Court ordered that the retrial take place in Maharashtra, in Bombay, and that's where some convictions happen, finally. Um, but those convictions included not only the convictions of some of the perpetrators of the violence, but also the victim of the violence, which is Zahira Sheikh herself, who was the hostile witness. Now, through the period that the trial ran, uh, three big Bombay films that released, um, Dev, Parzania, and Kaipoche. And the book studies those three films alongside the four judgments coming out of the trial. And um, I look at the way in which these two archives, both separately but also together, produce a particular memory of the Gujarat pogrom. Now, um, if you have to find out what kind of memory is produced, you'll possibly have to read the book. But I will give you four things that I have learned through my own analysis of the films and the judgments through this concentrated period. So, one of the key learnings from my reading of the judgments and the films is the logic through which both the judgments and the films understand the operation of time. Um, and time is a key element in the way in which memory is constructed, right? So um, both the cinematic archive and the judicial archive understand 2002 as a moment that produces something later. So there's a flashpoint moment that produces something. So I'll tell you what that is. So um, what produces the violence against Muslims in Gujarat is what happened in the Godhra railway station a day before the violence started. So the organization of memory, both in the films as well as in the judgments, holds on to Godhra as the trigger moment, as the precipitating moment, as what produces the violence. Now, and this is not merely a doing of the powers that be. Even most progressive commentators um, continue to refer to the 2002 pogrom as the post-Godhra riots, right? So as soon as you use that expression, you offer a justification for what took place, right? So, um, and this is not something that is new in the way in which events of mass violence are characterized. So you think about September 11th. Uh, you know, September 11th is understood as that history vanishing moment that produces everything, is becomes the reason for everything that comes afterwards. As if there was nothing that took place before September 11th that can help us understand September 11th. So September 11th has no explanation. It becomes the explanation for everything else, right? Or you think about October 7th, right? So you don't talk about what came before October 7th. Whatever comes after October 7th, so Israeli genocide in Gaza, is explained through October 7th. And so same treatment was being, meted out to the way in which Gujarat 2002 was being understood, is that Godhra happened, so the violence took place. So if Godhra didn't happen, the need for the violence wouldn't have arisen. Um, and so by making Godhra the flashpoint moment, what happens is that there are two forms of invisibilization that's forced on the way we remember the pogrom. One is that Muslims started it, and even if there is no factual basis to that argument, and Tista Settlebad has in her autobiography uses an expression called "who cast the first stone" thesis. So she understands this as the who cast the first stone, who threw the first stone. That becomes the trigger for who threw the later 100 stones. But the throwing of the 100 stones stand justified because of who cast the first stone. Um, so it invisibilizes the fact that um, Hindu right-wing organizing in Gujarat wasn't new. It invisibilizes the fact that uh, the mode in which the pogrom was carried out was so organized and meticulous that it couldn't have been a spontaneous response. Um, and it also uh, invisibilizes the fact that even if it was spontaneous, the fact that it could spread, in such a manner had to do with the active participation of state authorities, without which it wouldn't have happened, particularly the police. Now, this is where the second key, you know, takeaway from my analysis is the role that language plays in the way in which we remember things. So if I'm continuously using the expression post Godhra riots, which is the expression that most of the media use, including the progressive media, you are using a particular kind of language to describe what happened. And a riot is a spontaneous conflagration, right? It refers to something that is chaotic and unorganized. And it disregards the active role that state authorities play to enable the way in which a particular kind of targeting is carried out en masse in a very short period of time. Um, and we see this in the way in which the judgments use language. We see this in the way in which the films use language. So, Parzania is the only film that uses the word genocide to refer to the violence that took place. All the other films use the who cast the first stone thesis as a mode through which to understand um, what happened. Um, and I use the word pogrom in the book, which is not used either by the films or by the judgments, because it's the most descriptively accurate expression that I was able to find. For me, genocide wasn't necessarily a descriptively accurate expression. Um, because genocide is a legal term, and legal terms necessarily require events to meet threshold requirements for them to clarify. So you legalize a particular event when you use the word genocide. And that's been the case even with what's been happening in Gaza, because there have been Palestinian scholars, legal scholars, who've said that even the use of the expression genocide is inadequate to explain what is happening. It's too legalistic. So a lot of Palestinian legal scholars have been saying the word Nakba is perhaps the more accurate description of what is happening, which is it's catastrophe. And international law is incapable of working with that category called Nakba. So similarly, I use pogrom because it's the most descriptively accurate term. It's not something that I use as legal. Neither am I actually saying that pogrom is the last word on how to describe Gujarat. Because during my visits to Gujarat, both for the fieldwork related to the PhD, but also when I went there as part of the fact-finding team, in fact, I never heard the word genocide. I never heard the word pogrom. The vernacular words that were being used were words like kayamat, or words like tufan, or words like hullar. And so, uh, what describes a particular event of violence is actually not the legal requirements that that necessarily need to be met, but the intensity of the violence as understood by those who are experiencing it. So it's a more affective in nature than, technical. So I don't use the word pogrom technically. The reason I use the word pogrom is because it is the most descriptively accurate one, and it points to the active role that the state played in the enabling the violence. The third takeaway for me through my analysis is this very strong distinction that both the quotes and the films draw between secular law and religious violence. And in drawing this distinction, what both the films and the courts do is that they cast secular law as the remedy for religious violence. Whereas what my analysis demonstrates is that secular law is, in fact, the cause of religious violence on many occasions. So let me give you one illustration. Many cities in Gujarat, especially the city of Ahmedabad, um, urban organization is owed to the operation of a municipal law called the Disturbed Areas Act. Now, on the face of it, the Disturbed Areas Act is a secular law, right? It's not meant. Uh, it's not a religious law. It's made by a secular legislature, and it is not necessarily targeted at any particular religious community, but it's um, it's work in the context of the kind of communally organized city that Ahmedabad is demonstrates for us that what the Disturbed Areas Act has effectively done over a long period of time. So, what does the Disturbed Area? It basically stops people from selling property under conditions of distress. So, you cannot do distress sales. Now, who are the people doing distress sales or are under pressure to do distress sales in a place like Ahmedabad? These are primarily Muslims living in areas that are demarcated as disturbed by the act. So if you can't sell your property on one side of the Sabarmati, you can't buy property on the other side of the Sabarmati unless you're very rich. Um, And so, if you can't sell property, you end up staying where you stay. And over time, where you stay turns into a ghetto, which is why the Hindu side of the Sabarmati and the Muslim side of the Sabarmati are so starkly distinct in appearance, um, and how strongly religiously segregated the two sides are. On the Hindu side, the city looks, sleek, modern, big buildings, wide roads. On the other side, it's the stark opposite. On the Hindu side, you will hardly ever see a person who can be identified as Muslim by their attire, for instance. Um, and so when the mobs ran rampage, um, not only did they have census lists in their hand to know where to target, the organization of the city through this secular law called the Disturbed Areas Act already made it very easy for the mobs to know where to go, right? So you didn't have to go to the Hindu side of the city, you just had to go to the Muslim side because the the law has organized the city in a way where Muslims live in a ghetto. And if at all there was some violence on the other side of the Sabarmati, that violence was also starkly targeted. So I was living on Judges Bungalow Road, as I said. And if, say, for example, there was a big mall and there was one shop owned by whose owner was Muslim, that shop was specifically targeted. So you could see the mall is working all right, all the shops are fine, except for that one shop. And right across from the mall is a police station. right? So again, the why pogrom? Because it is so meticulous that nothing else gets burnt, but just that one shop. Everything else continues to, operate a week after the pogrom started on the Hindu side of the Sabarmati. And so one of the arguments that I make in this book is that in this clean separation that both the films and the judgments perform between secular law and religious violence, what happens is that secular law is absolved of all responsibility for actually having created the conditions for the pogrom, right? Um, this is also, for example, demonstrated through the way in which uh, the my my the fourth finding or my fourth takeaway, the third takeaway is a similar distinction that the courts and the films draw between liberal constitutionalism and religious fundamentalism. And this distinction is similar to the secular law religious violence distinction in the sense that the Constitution is the source of secularism, where religion is always the source of fundamentalism. Right? So trust the Constitution to remedy everything. Right? And uh, we see this, for example, in Dave, where the key character, Fardeen Khan, who's a Muslim boy, whose father is killed in by Amitabh Bachchan, who's the Hindu police officer. Um, but then Amitabh Bachchan saves Dev, you know, uh, after the pogrom because he was brainwashed by a Muslim fundamentalist politician. And despite the fact that Amitabh Bachchan opened fire on a peaceful protest that Fardeen Khan's father was leading, a peaceful protest by Muslims against the pogrom, um, uh, there is no conversation of Amitabh Bachchan's responsibility because Amitabh Bachchan represents constitutional liberalism in the film. And so Fardeen Khan, in the closing of the film, dons the lawyer's coat to walk up the steps of a courtroom to now, litigate for the victims of the violence. And we also see this distinction in the judgments, where uh, this distinction takes perverse form. So the one of the Supreme Court judgments that convicts Zahira Sheikh begins with a verse from the Manusmriti about the virtues of a good witness. Now here you have a constitutional court uh, committed to constitutional secularism, responding to the violence of the pogrom by invoking uh, one of the most regressive texts of Hindu law. And so again, uh, when it comes to a reference to Hindu law, it is absorbed into the pantheon of constitutional liberalism, whereas all Islamic positions are relegated to that of the to the side of religious fundamentalism. Um, and this is also played out, for example, in Parzania, which is otherwise possibly of the three films the most directly, the film that's more direct about what had happened, and the most powerful of the three films, as it were, because in Parzania we see that the Human Rights Commission space where the film's climactic scenes take place is a secular space. It's where the character of Nasiruddin Shah, who couldn't trust pursuing the course of law, he's Parsi in the film, and he goes to the fire temple. Uh, and there's another character, a Muslim character, whose father was killed in the pogrom, who wants to now take revenge on the Hindus. And Sarika, who's the character whose son is lost in the pogrom, who has faith in the secular mechanism that the Human Rights Commission has to offer. So the Human Rights Commission, in a certain sense, that secular space becomes the space that dissolves all religious differences and brings together, uh, Nasiruddin Shah, Sarika, and the character, the Muslim character who lost his father. Um, but the film, for example, despite presenting the Human Rights Commission as a panacea for the nature of violence that has taken place, offers no account of, for example, the role that secular law had played and continued to play at the time when the film was made, that both enabled the violence and continued to rationalize it. And finally, I'll end on this point. The the One of the key findings from my reading of the films and judgments is again the false binary that is drawn between memory and forgetting, and that's one of the reasons why I called the book Ways of Remembering. I find the opposition that is drawn between memory and forgetting to be quite an unhelpful one. Um, because I don't think since 2002 there has been any attempt, even by those who perpetrated the violence, to make us forget what happened in Gujarat 2002. So you did have, for example, the Home Minister saying, citing 2002 as a way to show the rest of India that because what we did in 2002 ensured that Gujarat never experienced another, you know, uh, another communal conflagration. Or you would have a film like the Sabarmati Report being watched by the whole, BJP cabinet, for instance. And so Gujarat 2002 is very much alive in memory. So it's a less a matter of whether there's been an attempt by the powers that be to make us forget the pogrom. It is actually a contestation between different kinds of memories rather than a contestation between memory and forgetting. And so that's the fourth thing that I take away from my reading of the films and the judgments. I think I'll stop there.
I thank you, Dr. Oishik. I think it was a wonderful presentation of the book also. At least for the people who have not read it, quite all the key points have been, because I think what was in my head was also to talk about the aesthetics of the courtroom and the one or two core thing of the book that you have brought out. It was really, and also in a very short time, it was quite engaging to also talk about the whole. I think the key takeaways of the thing that you said, and the four things that you brought out, and the whole triad that we have been talking about: law, movie, then we have the whole narrative, popular narrative, and how memory works in the whole thing. And with us, I think living in such a time right now where we have, how to say, like different type of ways through which short we have reduced memory, right? You have too many 30 seconds videos. So while you were speaking, I was just relating to it. I was like, this is something that we nobody forgets. It's just that you've kept something. It's not important maybe for that time, right? Or it is not right now. What you say, it's not popular nahi hai. It's not too much cool right now. Let us not talk about it. But what makes it popular and how memory is defined, who is popular in what context? I think one. Second, when it comes to the whole narrative of binaries right now that we are talking about, and the binary everywhere we talk about, be it a program, be it violence, I think the whole idea where we justify or sustain certain notion is also by creating false narrative or a false binary. It can be anything. For example, when you let us go beyond that, violence victims, who can be a legitimate victims in the eyes of any kind of law. If I could just for a second expand the whole discussion, and because my work is also on sexual violence, I particularly looked at men who are victims and looked at legality, international law, Yugoslavia, and where you could see that terminology and languages are not there to define what you really call when men are being raped. So, language, be it internationally speaking or be domestically speaking, and since the day we have BNS now, we do not have language to define certain type of crimes also. And again, it's a circle. If I'm not wrong, it's a circle. How you justify something which we do not have by creating it's okay because ये हमारे यहाँ पे नहीं होता है, या this is something उस we will have a different kind of law उसमें आ जाएगा ये. So I think the whole triad is just not limited to a particular. I think it's a very good case study through which we could see that. But public memory, collective memory, narrative, law, cinema right now is too much that we have. We could see it right now. Ki justifying any type you need for even for liberal capitalism to sustain. You have a certain narrative that you have built up. So I think this triad is something, or the triangulation, how power, ideology, justified by popular culture, maybe. If I can say that, it's such an interesting thing to see right now, and it's very interesting, and it's also you need to question it. If anybody has a question, I think we could start question answer. I think it was a very good session as far. Pratham, if you have a question, we can start. I think let us ask people to start writing the question, maybe. And I think I just muted. Kindly also mute. I think noise आ जाता है. So it would be great if you could have a hands up or if you could write a question. Then we can start a discussion. It was a very good presentation. Thank you so much for taking your time out. So it would be great if you could write your questions. It's easier for us so that we do not miss out.
While people are thinking about questions, can I make two quick points?
Yeah. Yeah, please.
So just something to so the three films that I look at in the book are in fact three films that are all in some form or the other critical of what happened in 2002, right? So they are actually offering secular critiques of an anti-Muslim pogrom. And what yet my reading demonstrates, and so are the courts, right? The courts are not, none of the judgments are saying that what happened in 2002 was great, right? But the aim of the book is to demonstrate that we need to be really, we need to be paying attention to secular liberal arguments as well and not absolve them of their complicity in bringing us to where we are currently. So the reason we have a Dhurandhar today, or the reason you could have a Kerala Files or a Bengal Files or whatever else, all these, whatever is being called propaganda film, um, and the reason why we are able to see what's wrong with them, or some of us are able to see what's wrong with them or disagree with what they're saying, is too in your face, right? These these films are not leaving anything, for your imagination. It's quite in your face in terms of what their agenda is or what kind of story they want to tell. Um, but I actually find a film like Dave to be far more insidious, and in a certain sense offering the foundations for today Durandhar to be made, and I'm saying this with a lot of sadness because I really like Govind Nilani as a filmmaker, as somebody who's been so important in the alternative film tradition, in India, somebody who's made a film like Ardh Satya, for instance, somebody who made Bisham Sani's Tamas into a TV series, and then for him to make Dev as a secular criticism, cinematic criticism of 2002, requires him to make use of the Amitabh Bachchan figure, um, to tell a story about a morally upright Hindu policeman who, in the opening scene of the film, shoots a college student, a Muslim college student, and then when he's called to um, you know, an inquiry commission, justifies that shooting by saying that whoever questions, the law, I don't care about their religion. I just kill them. Right? So that's the kind of moral uprightness that the film was celebrating, and and glorifying in a certain sense. Um, uh, and even with Kaipoche, which in fact is a film I liked watching, it's great music. I've never attempted to read the Chetan Bhagat book that it's based on, but I like the film. But Kaipoche is also insidious in another way, right? Because what Kaipoche tells us, because the pogrom is not directly related to the how the story begins and ends. But Kaipoche's insidiousness is demonstrated in the way in which two things happen. One is, you know, we see a glimpse into how the the shining new India will help us overcome any crisis. So, be it the Bhuj earthquake or Gujarat 2002, Gujarat can still have wide highways and coffee shops. And you can have a Muslim cricketing prodigy whose family was attacked during the pogrom still play for India and become the best player. Um, but the success of this is owed to the consolidation of the three Hindu castes. So the three protagonists are Brahmin, Banya, and Kshatriya. And when the Savarna castes come together and consolidate, that is what ensures the success of the new India, right? So, and in this success story of the new India, Muslims have a place as long as they're trained well by the Hindu, right? And whose loss is being mourned in that film at the end? uh, if you've watched it, it's the loss of the Hindu protagonist in the Sushant Singh Rajput character. Who's mourning that loss? It's another Hindu who's mourning that loss. But the fact that the pogrom targeted the Muslim community en masse, which is where that tragedy takes place, where Omi kills the Sushant Rajput character, becomes the primary site of remorse, um, reconciliation, and redemption. Right? So nobody is asking what happened to that Muslim boy's father, and his family. there is no account of that in the film. It is a success story, but because despite whatever happened, he's playing for Team India, right? That too in a private stadium. That is an outcome of the hard work of the Bania character in the film. Um, uh, so these are the two things that I wanted to say is that I think it is far easier to point out what's wrong with the current crop of films and far more difficult to actually find what was wrong in the secular critiques of 2002, which in fact paved the way for what we have on hand today. And I'm not saying it's conspiratorial. It's not that Govind Nilani and Aditya Dhar had some conversation to take the baton ahead. Clearly, they didn't. But I think uh, secularists have to take the blame partly for letting, uh, you know, India take this turn.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Oishik. Can we have questions? If anybody have any question, either raise your hand or you can type it here. I- Yes, Pratham.
Hi, hello. Am I audible? Yeah, cool. Thank you so much for the presentation. I also have had the fortune of reading that book, and I think it's a phenomenal book. I just have two questions. First question is about the methodology of the book, and I think it was a really interesting part for me to read as someone who engaged with law as much. I think ideas of law in as aesthetic, or maybe I think you earlier also talked about the conjoined habitus of law and cinema, or maybe just the idea of narrative compact of law and cinema and how all of them then consolidate into your approach, which is the jurisprudence aesthetic approach. And because I think it has significant impact for the way we understand the relationship between law and the outside world. There is a certain way in which law claims rationality, and law would assume objectivity. And I think the coming in of aesthetic sort of unsettles that. It would unsettle the secular and, as you said, but also the rational foundation of law. For instance, by the coming of affect, so AFET would, contest the objectivity of that law. So I was thinking just about how such an approach, if we were to extend it not just to the question of law and just not the question of violence, but also to the question of caste or maybe class. So how that would pan out if we were to, employ that approach and just look at how it can widen our understanding of law and how it relates to the outside world. The second question was about the last point you made about memory and forgetting. I think it was a very interesting bit to read about in the book as well, because I was just thinking about how that element could be then extrapolated to sort of think about the larger politics of Hindutva and the imaginations of history is now propounding. So, as you mentioned, so forgetting is also a certain kind of remembering. So that now make me think about how there are different visions of different visions of past that Hindutva would articulate, and how that would pan out. So I was just thinking about how your insights from the book can help us think more about the larger politics and not just restrict ourselves to Gujarat as like this aberration, but also think about the larger structural causes of violence. So just these two questions. Thank you so much.
You are muted. Yeah.
Um, Thank you, Pratham, for those two questions. I purposefully avoided talking about the method because I thought it would be too academic for a more generalist uh, audience. Um, so the method that I develop in the book serves both a disciplinary function for me as somebody who's located within the discipline of law, but it is also political, it has political ramifications, as you're pointing out. So the disciplinary, and they are connected, the disciplinary worth of the method and its political valence are connected. So law generally, as the way it is taught in law schools, for example, or the way in which it is understood within institutions that engage the law, like the judiciary, is understood as a self-referential discourse, right? So, uh, what I mean by self-referential is that it draws authority from itself, right? It doesn't draw authority from anything else, right? So, which is what the idea of the rule of law is, that it doesn't even draw authority from the state. The rule of law, in fact, limits the authority of the state. So there's something above the state called the rule of law, which, in liberal democratic setups we will call the Constitution, right? So there's something above the state called the Constitution. Even if it's the case that the state has made the Constitution is still above the state. Um, so the jurisprudential aesthetic approach emerges out of a long tradition of thinking within law, uh, uh, which tries to push against this orthodoxy, this self-referential orthodoxy of law, by saying that uh, by becoming self-referential, what the law either ignores or um, negates is that the sources of legal wisdom and authority could in fact be outside of law for many traditions, right? So uh, ideas of law needn't just emerge from within law, but it could also emerge from outside law. And so that, for example, will refer to, will be in the context of what some legal scholars call legal pluralism, is that the Constitution is not the only source. You could have a constitutional legal order alongside a religious legal order, alongside a cultural legal order. And all of these legal orders can have equal authority in the same space, right? So I'm speaking to you from Australia, where and in the state of Victoria, where very recently a treaty was established, and it's a treaty that recognizes that indigenous people have their own laws, and the laws of the settler state uh, will not have control over indigenous laws, for example. And there are similar treaties in other settler colonial states like Canada, for instance. India is a religiously plural, a legally plural jurisdiction as well, because you have, religious laws alongside, so-called secular laws. But, the tendency is always to create a hierarchy of, even when it's plural, the tendency of the modern state is always to create a hierarchy of law. So even if there are plural religious laws, the Constitution still becomes the law that validates or invalidates such laws, right? So, or you would have an attempt where you'll try and use secular laws to consolidate all other laws. So a call for the Uniform Civil Code, um, for instance. Um, or when, for example, you will try and say that historically a particular legal order, um, so there's plurality in, this is answering Pratham's first question. Plurality can work in both positive and negative ways. So you could have plurality in the sense of um, legal orders where one legal order tries to dominate over other legal orders, and that would be, a particular negative version of plurality. A positive version of plurality would be that, uh, Muslim women, for example, to settle disputes, might want to go to the Muslims Jamaat, the women's Jamaat, rather than going to a court of law, right? Because that's where they think they can. That's the adjudicatory forum that they think they might want to um, um, trust. Similarly, one could say that what came before the Constitution was the law of caste, right? And the Constitution, in fact, introduced a plural legal order that was meant to undo the law of caste, right? So the law of caste still continues to exist. So it's plural both in the positive sense of having other sources of law, positively plural, but it's also negatively plural in the sense that you have these deep historically violent legal orders coexisting alongside the emancipatory promise of the Constitution. Now, when we start thinking about law in this fashion, that it doesn't have a singular source, that it has multiple sources, these multiple sources are both inside and outside of the state, um, you cannot not pay attention to the fact that our ways of engaging and understanding these sources are not strictly technical, right? Our ways of understanding these sources are also aesthetic, right? So when, for example, the Niyamgiri protest started in Orissa, when Vedanta was trying to set up their aluminium plant there, the uh, the the Adivasis who were protesting were saying that the reason they were protesting is because the setting up of the Vedanta plant was taking place on Niyam Raja. Niyam Raja was the hill, and they were calling it Niyam Raja because it for them was the hill of law, right? And so the hill of law is not a law text that you can read, right? it's it's part of the natural habitat of the Dongria Kond in Orissa. And so you can only appreciate that if you have an aesthetic sensibility to understand what is the relationship between the indigenous people and the land, right? It's not a relationship that is available to us, in the language of the law of property, for instance, that our relationship to land is only understood through a paper with the state seal on it telling us that we own it, right? So that's one way for me to think about how the jurisprudential aesthetic lens can be used to think about plural legal orders and to identify and appreciate the ways in which we think about sources of law, that because they're not all textual. And so as soon as we move out of the textualist way in which to think about law, we'll have to activate aesthetics in certain ways. And for me, aesthetics is less about beauty. It's more about uh, the literal meaning contained in that word. So aesthetic for me is the opposite of anesthetic. So if anesthetic is what you're given when you're undergoing a surgery so that you don't feel pain, to be aesthetic is to basically be alive to your senses, right? So we identify law as a sensory form of knowledge. It's not always textual. And that sensorial nature of law can also take many forms. That sensorial nature of law can take the form of, for example, um, you know, joy. So when Section 377 of the IPC is read down by the Delhi High Court, you see celebration happening outside of the court. So, how do we understand what law is? By looking at, joy on the one hand. You have the current, protests against the transgender bill, which is, sites of great agony and pain and sadness of betrayal. How do you understand that, right? When you see protests in campuses after Rohit Vemula death by suicide, how do you understand that as an expression of legal injustice? And so a jurisprudential aesthetic lens would basically say that, or basically help us see what otherwise might not look as something that has anything to do with law, but will help us see that there is, legal wisdom in all of these sensorial ways in which everyday life uh, is organized. And the second question, sorry, what was the second question, Pratham? Quickly remind me.
It was on
I
Yeah,
did have
Hindutva.
an.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was on Hindutva and how do you see?
memory
Uh,
and forgetting diad. Yeah.
right, right, right. Yeah. So I don't think I'm making a new argument about not pitting memory and forgetting against each other. And I think, uh, you know, historians of fascism have made this point for a long time that um, the way in which fascism is able to regenerate itself continuously is not through impositions of forgetting. It's actually through productions of memory, right? So, um, and which is why, for example, you will see that a lot of anti-Zionist Jews have deep suspicions about the role that Jewish memorials have played since the Holocaust in fomenting a certain kind of support, political support for the state of Israel. And so memorialization, which is a mode through which you remember, is never innocent, right? So the problem is less with forgetting. The problem more is how we are remembering, right? Um, so Aisha Khan, a journalist who covered the Best Bakery case very closely, who I cite in the book as well, and I'd interviewed her in Bombay, and she reported for the Indian Express uh, when the pogrom was taking place. And I interviewed her at a time when there was some conversation going on about turning the Gulberg Society, another site where a massacre took place in the city of Ahmedabad, into a museum of memory, right? And it was very much in line with the kind of Holocaust museums that you see in other parts of the world. And as a Muslim herself, she was very, very opposed to the idea of something like a Holocaust memorial. And she said that, monuments to the memory of the pogrom, might not always be an empowering mode through which we respond to the violence. And I had, in my previous book, Violent Modernities, I have a chapter on my visit to Gulberg Society. It's a chapter called The Silence of Gulberg. And I visited there with one of the victim survivors who used to live at in Gulberg Society. And he told me something really important about turning that place into a museum. And he said that, it's a violation of our right to mourn, because as long as Gulberg remains the way it is, which is, in this dilapidated state where, nobody lives, it's fully abandoned. Only dogs live there now. But it at least is a sanctuary, for those living to just go and spend a little bit of time with those who they've lost in peace. If it becomes a museum, then it becomes a regulated space. You will start curating memory in a certain sense. Um, so in the memory versus forgetting, uh, you know, um, relationship, forgetting, always gets gets critiqued. You'll have to remember against the way in which the fascists are making us forget the violence of history. But and that the same with Hindutva, for instance. I don't think the way in which Hindutva politics thrives is through making us forget. It's actually through making us remember things in a particular way, right? Um, yeah, and so that and as I said, that this is not something new that I am saying, but 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 I think we would be mistaken to think about memory as and forgetting as oppositional. Um, Memory effectively is a way of forgetting or the other way around, and that's how regimes of power uh, you know, operate. And there's nothing particularly, and one of the ways of doing that is by creating these history vanishing moments. February 26th, Gujarat, October 7th, Hamas attack, September 11th, Taliban attack. So uh, instead of saying you forget what came before that date, you say memory begins from here. So everything that happens from this moment onward, its only referent point is that day, right? So you don't necessarily speak in the language of forgetting. You, in fact, speak in the language of memory beginning from a particular point.
Uh, Anybody has a question? I think, yeah. Yeah, I'll just read out the question. Uh, Nikita Sharma asks, "Hello, Dr. Sarkar. It is always a pleasure listening to you. I had the pleasure of listening to you previously at Ambedkar University when you came to give a lecture for Dr. Rukmini Sen's class on law and society. For today's discussion, I was interested in knowing how class as an identity configured in constituting the structure of Ahmedabad as a city. Class, irrespective of religious identity. Was there awareness among people on the Muslim side of Sabarmati that law itself is disempowering them?"
Um, yeah, I mean the simple answer to that question is yes, and I think, um, I mean the Satchar Committee report has enough evidence to tell us that the intersection of class uh, and being Muslim is intrinsic to the experience of marginalization that Indian Muslims face. And so uh, Muslims on the other side of Sabarmati have a very, very texture sense of the role that um, the Disturbed Areas Act has played in the production of the Muslim ghetto of one side of the Sabarmati. And I would, if yeah, I'm not an urban studies scholar, so all my insights are in fact drawn from others who have been, ethnographically studied the city of Ahmedabad. And one such scholar is the anthropologist Parviz Ghassan Fachandi, who wrote a book called Pogrom in Gujarat. In fact, it's because of Chandi that I use the word pogrom in my book, and because I thought he makes a really compelling argument in his book about why the word pogrom is the most accurate description. Um, and he talks about the way in which the urban design of Ahmedabad is a product of the Disturbed Areas Act, but a whole range of other factors, like dietary preferences is another reason. The another way in which the urban arrangement of the city is produced. So what he calls is the disgusting meat-eating Muslim is pushed to one side of the Sabarmati, and the pure Hindu is on the other side. And that's on the other side, you have, for example, the world's first vegetarian Pizza Hut, the world's first vegetarian um, McDonald's. And so again, that there's a class dimension there that, all of these global chains are on one side of the Sabarmati and not on the other side. And thank you for reminding me of your, that you were in Rukmini's class. I'm sorry I don't remember you by face, Nikita, but it's good to see you. I mean, good to meet you here, and I hope this answers your question.
Do we have any more questions?
Sanjukta, if there's
Yes. Hi,
I'm
Jigyasa.
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm in unstable internet conditions and I've somehow logged in from the dark account and not my account. So I'm sorry for that. Um, Thank you for this discussion and the book. Um, I will try and switch on my video if it's possible. Yes. Um, Thank you. So my question comes again. I'd like to insert a effect in space and probably raise some of my not concerns, some of the questions again methodologically. I had the chance to teach a paper on effect and constitution and how emotions, the things that I'm taking from our hot and cold passions. Vatsal Naresh speaks of it in a chapter about how constitution making itself had hot passions and cold passions. So I was wondering if we were to see a courtroom as a passionate as a place of passion, and when you say law involves senses, or if one were to think in terms of senses in the courtroom space, uh, and if that and then apart from court as a movie, I don't think cinema has captured the reality of a courtroom space. Uh, and the possibilities it creates in terms of course one of the movies that you work on uh, in the courtroom in a
See, it might be good if you, sorry, I think your connection is quite
I think
weak. So maybe if you turn off the video, we might still be able to hear the question.
I think, yeah, she got disconnected if I'm not wrong. She will ask you question via email. That's what she has just
I'm
yes, she's here.
I'm so sorry. My internet. I'm actually in a place. I was here for a faculty development program. So what I'll do is I'll write an email and maybe I'll have a longer chat with you over email about some of the questions and methods. So sorry.
Sure, but if you want to take another shot at it by turning off your video in case that
Let
works.
me do this. Let me do this. Actually, if I was speaking to a video screen, I would like just a black screen. I would be terrified. Is why I switched it on so that you could put, place
Yeah,
me in
but
the
if the
universe.
if your
But I'm going to switch
connection's
on the
weak,
video.
then yeah.
Let me switch on the video. Yeah. So I wanted to think out loud here about a paper that I offered to law students on effect in the Constitution, and some of the things that I have in mind. I said were, the idea of hot passions and cold passions, and a new literature that is. I'm sure it's an old literature, but at least I got acquainted to it in the last 10 years about constitution making processes is emotion processes of emotions and passions and so on and so forth. And I was wondering what role would the uh, you use aesthetics, but if I were to think in terms of emotions, what role do courtroom spaces or what role do courts play as spaces of emotion making, and because memorialization, if one were to, and you referred to at that in terms of, celebration of certain dates, celebration of certain historical events, in fact, in some senses, state uh, keeps memory within, archive with the capital A as part of its memory project. And both secular state and, say, ethno-nationalist state would be guilty of memorializing state power in a certain way. But there's a certain way in which courtroom emotions, or say, uh, senses as one would experience them in the space of the court, are less visible, less tangible, even the public iterations of the senses of the law. And I'm taking from what you've just said about plurality of law, and the sensibility of senses of law. Um, Apart from cinema, and that too very scarcely, courtroom space has not become a space of public uh, memory, or creation of public memory. And I was wondering, what do you think about, how do you look at that? Because there is an attempt, and you are doing that conversation about aesthetics and courtrooms. Yeah.
You are muted.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for that question. No, so I don't think I am studying courtrooms in my book because this is not an ethnographic study. I'm not going into courtrooms and looking at what the participants in a courtroom are doing. This is what I'm studying are texts, so cinematic texts and judicial texts, and I'm trying to read them against the grain in the sense that I'm reading them for what they will not apparently give me. So a judicial text will not apparently give me anything about aesthetics, and a cinematic text will not apparently give me anything about jurisprudence. So I'm trying to do that counterintuitive reading of these two different genres of texts. Um, um, Through what I'm calling is a jurisprudential aesthetic lens, because my argument is that the aesthetic is built into the law as much as legal wisdom is built into, cinema. Um, so that's not what my book does. But if you are interested in the courtroom space as a space that is imbued with a certain sense of passions, there is a fair amount of work on that's been done, where people have done courtroom ethnographies. Um, but also those who do courtroom ethnographies from an aesthetic point of view. So not everybody who does courtroom ethnography is necessarily attentive to the question of aesthetics. Some people who do courtroom ethnographies pay attention to the aesthetics. So my colleague here at Melbourne Law School, James Parker, wrote a book some years back called Acoustic Jurisprudence. And in that, he studies the trial of somebody who was on trial for genocide in the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda. Somebody, a musician called Simon Bikindi. And what he tried to do in studying this trial is to look at because what was Bikindi accused of in that trial was of inciting genocide through music. What the trial was more interested in were the words of the songs he wrote. What Parker was interested in his book was the music that accompanied the words. And his argument in the book is that, very simply put, as he uses his argument in the book, is that law is deaf to sound. So the only way in which the law is able to adjudicate is through an engagement with words. So only thing it can interpret are words. So what might it be if you were to train law to interpret sound, right? So what would you do if you were to look at the music that Bikindi's songs, you know, accompanied the words, and did the music play a role in the incitement of genocide, right? So that's one way to think about how to attend to the question of passions in the courtroom by attending to the aesthetic and not just attending to get courtroom ethnography in the way it's generally done. It's a great courtroom ethnography that's available. More recently, there's a book by Mayur Suresh on terror trials in Delhi's court. So it's a courtroom ethnography, but it's not one that uses the aesthetic lens um, to do so. And similarly, there are studies of for example, the Gacaca courts in Rwanda, which were kind of uh, folk courts, as it were. Uh, um, Again, where the mode of reconciliation between a perpetrator and a victim was, for example, through singing and dancing. Or if you think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings in the context of post-apartheid South Africa, and there are studies, where that try and understand, how does how does an adjudicatory forum make sense of wailing, somebody who's crying, not able to speak a single word because of how deeply traumatized they are in a courtroom space. So the thing with the discipline of law, but I would think it's the same with the discipline of literature, or even to a great extent, even humanist disciplines like history, is that there is too much of a reliance on words to be able to help us arrive at answers to certain questions. And sometimes language is the problem because for a lot of things you don't have the language. Language is the barrier. There could be other ways to think about experiences outside of language. And for that you require, non-textual methods so you cannot always rely on language to interpret, those expressions of experiences. And so something that, not a book on law, but something that Urvashi Butalia does in The Other Side of Silence when she's collecting testimonies of women, and the book is an indication of what was it that she was trying to interpret in that book. She was trying to interpret silence, something that wasn't expressed through words. And so what do you need to then, use, or what modes of engagement do you need to activate to then interpret something that doesn't give you what is most easily interpretable, which is words. I don't. This is a very long-winded response to your question. I don't even know whether it's an answer that you were looking for.
If I may, like, if there is no more question, I think we should. It was a long conversation, and it was a very interesting conversation. I think we should have more such conversation, at least in this day and context. Those conversation are very important, I think. And if I may, Pratham, if you can conclude. Thank you so much, by the way.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Sure. I think with this we come to the session. We did team a dark and a heartfelt thanks to Dr. Sarkar for what was a very insightful conversation. The responses, your patience with the questions, everything was extremely helpful and very grateful for that. We also thank everyone who has gathered over Zoom today for this session. We hope you got something meaningful to think about and take back home. And we look forward to hosting you for other sessions as well. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And thank you to the DAC team for your generosity and engagement, and everyone who attended, and for your questions.
Thank you so much.
It's pretty late for me, but it's the questions that kept me going. So thank you very much for your engagement. I appreciate it very much.